Hello, Green Spring. Today is Wednesday, April 5th, 2017. I'm Fran Duval, your host for today, and so happy to again be here with Len Cockworth to do our quarterly presidential library visit. Good morning, Len.
Good morning.
So here we are.
Today we're going to talk about Richard Nixon, and I have a feeling that most people, when they think about Richard Nixon, think about Watergate and the fact that he was the first and only president to have resigned the office. But there is so much more to talk about Nixon than just that. And we're going to do that in a two-part series this time. The second part will be shown in May, but today we're going to start out talking about Nixon. And let me begin by saying that Beverly and I went to California deliberately to see the presidential libraries there. And the two libraries, of course, is that of Ronald Reagan and Richard Nixon. And we had a delightful time seeing Ronald Reagan's library because it's such a beautiful, large library on top of a mountain. And we'll talk about that in the future program. But when we left there, and of course we went from more of a countryside to an urban area to see Nixon's library, I thought to myself, you know, this is going to be a real letdown because Reagan's library was so fantastic and such a beautiful setting. How could this be any better? I was really very much surprised and pleasantly surprised when I got to Nixon's library because there was so much to see that they had placed there about him. We first of all, we drove up to a large parking lot outside of the library with a large water fountain next to it. And then we walked into the library, and the first thing that we saw in the library was a cutout of Elvis and Richard Nixon.
Oh, yes.
Yes. Well, Elvis had written a letter to the president, and he got an audience with the president. Nixon apparently was very interested in meeting with him, but what Elvis wanted, apparently, he wanted to have a special assignment as a narcotics person. And he did not receive that. But it's interesting that of all the pictures that are requested by the National Archives, Elvis' picture with Nixon is requested more than even the Bill of Rights or the Constitution.
Good heavens.
Yes. All right. Let me start talking about Nixon the man. He was, every biographer that I read indicates that he was a very, very strange, different type of person. He didn't apparently particularly like people. And we have no idea why, except if we want to talk about his background. His father apparently was a very harsh man. They did not get along well. His mother was apparently a very pleasant woman, but also a very hard taskmaster at home. And there are those who say that a lot of this was due to the fact that he had such a hard life as a young person, that he had to get up early in the morning, 4 o'clock in the morning, because his dad had a grocery store and he had to go to LA to get the produce. They had no electricity in their house and so on. I'm not so sure that makes up for it. There are many of us who had a similar background.
You had a similar background.
Similar background. Maybe it made me the same way. I don't know, but it seemed to me that that's no excuse in terms of his background. He lacked charm. He lacked warmth. He was very much of an introvert. He was not. He was socially very awkward. He had very few friends. He couldn't really be engaged in small talk. And the other thing is, and this is interesting for a politician, he didn't like to press the flesh. He didn't like to shake hands with people. It almost indicates that he really didn't like people at all. And in many ways, you'd have to say that he was the most complex president we've ever had, at least up until now. I'm not so sure. We'll talk about that maybe in the second part of this program. But he had a long nursed anger and resentment. And a lot of that resentment had to do with people who were better off than he was. Not intellectually, but socially. And materially, and he held that, and he had a number of grudges that he definitely kept. And one thing that may have had some effect upon him, when he was in college, and he went to college at Whitaker College in California. He apparently had a very lovely girlfriend, and they dated for several years, and then she broke it off, and apparently that really hurt him. For years, he continued to nurse some anger about that. He was intellectually very bright. He could have gotten into the best schools possible, but they didn't have the money. He was a straight A student, by the way. He could have gone into Harvard and Yale and any one of those schools without any question. But as I say, his parents did not have the money to allow him to do that. And so he went to the law school in Duke University, which apparently is a very good law school, but it does not rate the same way that the Harvard and Yale would. And then he had some real resentment because he tried to get a position in Wall Street, but they would not hire him because he didn't come from one of those prestigious law schools. And that was one of the things that really made him very, very angry. Let's move on to his marriage and his family.
Excuse me a minute.
Yes.
Would you move your wire so that you're not going to pull it?
Okay, there we go.
I didn't want you to, your
All right, we're fine.
microphone has gotten lower and lower.
They're fine. Okay. All right, let's go on to marriage and family. We have several pictures here. And these pictures have to do with, well, first of all, this is the entrance to the library.
To the library.
Okay. And next to it was a big water fountain right on the parking lot. And as we walked into it, then we would see the cutout of Elvis and Nixon. But I'd like to talk a little bit more now about his family, especially about Pat Nixon. This is his house where he was born. It was reconstructed apparently or moved here. His father built this house, I think from a kit, like one of the Sears Roebuck.
Sears,
Yeah, and a very modest home. In it is the bedroom where he was born, and I think we have a picture of that. There it is. And then there's another picture of him, his piano, where he learned to play. And you may recall that he used to play quite often. And I think Harry Truman was not very happy one time when he came to the Harry Truman's library and played. Truman just did not appreciate that. Okay. Now this is Pat Nixon's amphitheater in her honor. And along outside of that is one of the great rose gardens. And there were any number of roses that I think more variety of roses than any place in any other garden in California. There was a special rose that was developed by a French company called Pat Rose, and it was red and black. And there were 80 varieties of roses in this particular garden. Now, of course, Pat Nixon had a stroke, and there was she was in rehabilitation for a while, and there was the wheel that she had to use to get better as a result of her stroke. Now, apparently, the marriage was a kind of a loveless marriage because Richard Nixon himself was so cold. Many of her dresses were there. There were several rooms, by the way, devoted just to Pat Nixon. All right. There's the wheel that she was using. Now, I purposely put this picture in here because of all the pictures that I've ever seen of Richard Nixon, he is always dressed up in a suit and tie, even to the point when he was walking along the beach. He was dressed up,
right.
Wingtip shoes, remember that?
Right.
Yeah, and this is the only, and I was very much surprised to see him in a bathing suit with his children. Of course, this was early on, but
right.
All right, okay. Now, Nixon, here's his whole family. He had two daughters, of course. One of them married the grandson of Eisenhower.
Right.
Yes. Okay. Even when Nixon reached the presidency, it still did not satisfy him. He was somehow just was reaching for more. He didn't know what, but constantly reaching for more. And he talked so much about his feelings, his inner feelings, which is interesting for a man who was such an introvert, just letting it all hang out, so to speak. He wrote his book, The Six Crises, for example, in which he talks about his feelings. Somebody said he was like a Shakespearean president. He lived the tragedy and made everybody live the tragedy with him, and that's probably a good expression of what happened. He accomplished a lot more than we, I think, would acknowledge, oftentimes recognize, and we'll go through some of those things a little bit later. Somebody said he was our last progressive president, and I think many people might be surprised to hear that because he was a Republican, but he was extremely progressive. He was very much like McKinley and Teddy Roosevelt in terms of his accomplishments and so on. And the other thing you have to say about Nixon, he was amazingly resilient. Nothing seemed to stop him. He would be knocked down and he would come up again, even to the point of after he left the presidency, when he resigned, he remade himself kind of as an authority on foreign affairs, and people saw him as a statesman, and many of the politicians would go to him for advice and understanding. So he constantly remade himself, so he was very, very resilient. He really had a following, even almost to the end. There were people who stood by him, thought he was very great. Of course, he was forced to resign, and we'll talk about that in more detail later on. Now, he had enemies. He had enemies that he felt he had, and one of his enemies was anybody who had more wealth and education than he did, or came from a so-called higher social class, and they were constantly his enemies. And
I thought you were going to say one of them was the press.
actually, that was one of the.
Anyway, don't let me get you off track.
Yeah, absolutely, and that says it's interesting that he should that you should bring that up. But let me go back first of all to his first political race, and this tells us something about the kind of man that he was. In 1945, his first attempt in political office was running for representative, and he ran against a 5-term congressman by the name of Voorhees, and right away it was a very ruthless campaign. And the philosophy that he and his campaign manager had was, you don't just defeat your opponent, you destroy him. And that was his approach. And not only in terms of his running for the representative, that was also true in terms of running as for the Senate, which took place later. But let me just mention, after he was elected to the House, he portrayed himself, even during his campaign, as a sympathizer with he portrayed his opponent as a sympathizer with the labor unions, which he said was communist. And this, of course, is how Nixon made himself. He was an anti-communist, and I think we have to go back and think in terms of the what society was like at that time. It was so anti-communist, red baiting, red hunting, and so on. And he lobbied right after he was elected to get himself on the House Un-American Activities Committee, which he was successful. And of course, at that time they were against many of the people who were in Hollywood, because they said that there were so many communists in Hollywood. Right. And he promoted that. Then the big thing that really helped him was Whittaker Chambers and Alger Hiss trial. Whittaker Chambers had been communist, admitted it, and he said that Alger Hiss, who was a member of the State Department, was also a communist. And of course, that's when the Hiss Chambers thing took place, and Nixon made a name for himself at that time. Also, at this time, he made friends with Senator Joseph McCarthy from Wisconsin, who was probably the greatest hunter of communists. He was the one who made the statement that there were 57 communists in the State Department, and he had the names. Somebody said he got that number off the ketchup bottle when he was speaking.
The Heinz 57.
Heinz 57, yeah, which may be true. Then he ran for Senate almost immediately, and he ran against a woman by the name of Helen Douglas. I forget her middle name, her maiden name, but she had been a movie actress, had been very successful. She was well liked, and then she served as a senator. And by the way, it was a known and open knowledge of her affair with Lyndon Johnson. But when Nixon ran against her, he called her the pink lady, that she was a communist, and said that she was pink all the way down to her underwear. That was one of his comments. And of course he won. The other thing that he did at that point, her husband was Jewish, and of course he attacked him as well, and he was very, very anti-Jewish.
Well, he was a Quaker himself.
He was a Quaker.
His religion, yeah.
Yes, and his mother had been a very staunch Quaker. He is the second Quaker president we've had, other than Herbert Hoover.
Right.
Two men are quite different, by the way. Okay. Now, let's move on to him becoming a national figure. He was a hero to so many people. He maneuvered continually to promote himself, and he promoted himself to get on the national ticket. He wanted to be running as vice president. Now, Eisenhower was nominated, of course, to run as president. And at that point, Eisenhower left the selection of a vice president up to the party. Well, Nixon maneuvered in the background very much so, and several very shady things took place, I think. One was the California delegation left California to go to the convention, the national convention, by train. And at that point, Nixon went through the train, talking to the delegates, and spreading the false rumor that Taft was losing ground to Ike. Well, that wasn't true at that particular point, but that's he was trying to promote Eisenhower, of course. And then he also publicly pledged his loyalty to Governor Warren, who was on the train at the same time. And then he started telling the delegates that Warren had absolutely no chance of winning, even though he had pledged his support for. He was very ruthless in that way, and very devious. When the convention took place, of course, Eisenhower was elected, nominated, and then Nixon was nominated by the party to be the vice president. And one of the first things he did after he had been nominated, he walked over to Eisenhower and said, "Congratulations, Chief." And Eisenhower just did not appreciate that comment, and it was off to a very bad start. In fact, the whole 8 years that they were together, it was a very tense relationship. In fact, Nixon made some comment that he had never been invited by Eisenhower to go to his farm at Gettysburg, which Nixon was hurt by that, but Eisenhower just really didn't want anything to do with him. Then, of course, after the nomination, became known that there was a secret fund, secret financial fund that Nixon had, and so he had to explain himself. And so he went on television, and the famous speech, the checker speech that he made, in which he referred to the fact that he really did not receive any gifts except that they had received this dog for his children, and they would not give that dog back. The dog was called Checkers. Now, a lot of people, because of that, felt he's a real family man, and because of that, he was accepted. But Eisenhower had said to him before the speech that he should write his letter of resignation, and then Eisenhower, after the speech, would decide what to do. And he never did that. And Eisenhower did not appreciate that either, because he just disobeyed what Eisenhower wanted him to do immediately. Now, Pat Nixon never got over all of this, the things that were going on, and she despised politics. And she made Nixon promise that after this was over, after his term was over as vice president, he would leave politics. And he promised, but he broke the promise. And again, it kind of indicated the type of man that Nixon was. Okay, we're going to go on when he's running for president, and I think we have a couple of pictures here. When he's running for president, he was running against JFK. He and Lodge ran together. Here again, he was advised not to go into the televised speech or the debate, because they felt that he was well known. JFK was not very well known, and this would give him the promotion that Nixon should not allow to have happen. But Nixon could not step aside from a debate or a fight, so to speak.
Sounds familiar.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
He wanted to be the winner, and he wanted to win that way. You see. Well, in that particular debate, the televised debate, those who listened to the debate on radio said that there was no question in their mind that Nixon really won the debate. However, those who saw the television debate felt that JFK definitely won, and one of the reasons they felt he won because JFK showed all that youthfulness. He came across very well, appearance-wise. And Nixon came across with his 5 o'clock shadow, as they said, and he was sweating profusely. They just felt he had lost. But anyway, that's how that particular thing happened. Let me just see, when they ran, after they ran for office, Nixon really felt that the Kennedy family had stolen the election, because there was some real question about what happened in Chicago. And Nixon was encouraged to file a lawsuit, and Nixon felt that would just drag the country through too many years or too many months of difficulty, so he decided not to do that. And that was probably, politically was a wise thing, but morally was probably also the right thing to do. So then he went to California, back to California, and then he ran for governor against the incumbent Pat Brown, and he lost. And of course, he took that very hard, and this was when he made his infamous statement when he said to the press, "You don't have Nixon to kick around anymore." So he supposedly was going to stop at that point. He joined a New York law firm, and apparently immediately began to build up relationships with a lot of different politicians across the country, with the whole idea of being able to run again and run for president. All right, how much time do we have? We have some time left?
A few minutes, yeah.
Okay. just to show the kind of man that Nixon was, he lied. He lied frequently. LBJ was president, and of course LBJ was not going to run again. Herbert Humphrey was going to run, and at that particular point, LBJ had that Paris peace conference going on, and apparently they had reached pretty much of an agreement of how to end the war in Vietnam. And one of the things that they said to Nixon, please don't do anything to upset that particular possibility. And Nixon said he wouldn't, but he did. And he made certain that the peace progress did not take place so that Humphrey would not get the benefit of getting elected. And so he lied very definitely. LBJ had lost the South because of his civil rights, and now Nixon did everything possible to win the South back again. And one of the first things he did was to appoint a Southerner as a vice president named Spiro Agnew, a rather mediocre governor, who later had to resign the vice presidency. But Nixon, as a result of that, kind of realigned the whole political landscape, very much like LBJ had realigned it in a different way. But Nixon now was getting the South back as Republicans. Now, the four things that Nixon stood for at that particular point: he said he opposed big government, he opposed a liberal Supreme Court, he needed to reduce taxes and increase defense spending, and he criticized the expansion of the federal government under LBJ, LBJ's Great Society. So Nixon really transformed the party of Lincoln into a kind of a racist party, and one that despised the big government. Nixon also believed in what was called the great man theory. He said he didn't feel that society changed as a result of economic and social events. It changed because of a man. I guess he thought of himself as being that man. Okay. All right. Do we have time to go on to?
Just we have about 2 minutes.
Okay. Let me just talk a little bit about his accomplishments, domestic accomplishments. And some of these are a little surprising. He initiated a program to fight cancer and illegal drugs. He imposed wage and price controls. That's kind of anti-Republican, but he enforced desegregation of the Southern schools. He introduced legislation to reform health care and welfare. Now, this is the shocker. But he established the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency. We've heard about that lately, haven't we?
Yeah, we have.
He also established OSHA, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. He signed into law the Clean Air Act, and then he presided over the lunar landings with Apollo 11, and then later on the shuttle mission. So I will stop there, and in part two we'll pick up his accomplishment, the foreign accomplishments, and then we'll talk about some of his other liberal things that he did, and I'd like to compare him to our present president and see the similarity between Nixon and our present president. Okay.
Well, that'll come with our part two.
Yeah.
Which will be shown, I think, middle of May.
May 15.
May something.
Monday, May 15.
May 15. Yeah. So to know more about, we usually only do one show on a president.
Yeah.
But this requires, it really does require it.
Yeah.